What's next for IT? In today's economy, technology touches every aspect of the day-to-day operations of business. There has never been more pressure on IT to deliver for our organizations. So what can we expect over the next decade? We need to think differently about how we approach our work to continue to thrive into the future. This requires all of us to be intentional in how we look at our role going forward. Smart IT is an approach to getting the important things done by transforming the way we think, work, and lead. And now, let's disrupt the status quo, simplify the complex, and reduce risk the smart IT way. Hey, hello. This is William with the Smart IT Podcast. And today I'd like to welcome Dan Holden to the show. Dan holds the esteemed prestige of being Chief Information Security Officer of an e-commerce firm that we will get him to describe a little bit more about his role. Dan has many experiences being on the front line of defending our organizations against a wide range of cyber threat actors, which we will get into. Dan, welcome to the show today.
Thanks, William. I appreciate you having me here. Looking forward to it.
So, Dan, I was thinking about you. I said, let's turn our focus. We're talking a lot about IT in this Smart IT podcast, the framework of all the work that IT professionals do to design, architect, and bring up some very sophisticated architecture, right? All in the support of supporting business disruption, business transformation, and just the day-to-day operations of business in the modern economy. So one of the things all this technology and infrastructure and capabilities provides is a nice target from the bad guys. So everything from nation states to criminal organizations to hacktivists. So I was thinking about, hey, let me get started on a Smart IT podcast from a security standpoint. Let me call up Dan, bring him on, get his perspective on what's going on and kind of the life of a CISO, right? I mean, this is a dedicated role to run a security program to help IT kind of keep the business up and running. So I thought about you and I said, let's bring you on board here because we focus in on this next decade for IT professionals and figure out how we keep our systems up and running and kind of defend our way of life. Wanted to get your perspectives on a couple of different topics. But first, I'll just kind of get an introduction from you and just kind of get a little feel for, like, how did you get into the security space itself?
I'm an old hacker from the 90s. Came up in that scene, really enjoyed it. It was just like everyone sees in the movie Hackers, not the swirly pictures. The computers, of course, were not accurate. But I think that movie is so endearing to so many of the people of that era because it does capture the scene well. You know, there was a lot of funky clothes and rollerblades and all the tropes. And so it was a really fun time to come up. And of course, it was really a hobby and a scene. And I think everyone was a little surprised. Well, I was surprised that it ended up turning into a career. It wasn't my plan. I was going to go into marketing. So it's funny how things turn out. I still have a great affinity for marketing, but I've always liked the business just as much as the technology. But amazingly enough, there started to become some real companies in the 90s. And so I ended up working for a company called ISS, or Internet Security Systems, for a dozen years as a part of X-Force, which is still alive and well under IBM. And that's how and where I started. And I think it's shaped the way I view still this industry and my place in it. I still very much view it as a community. And, back then when we were, kids, it was really about learning. And these days, it's about taking all of that and trying to apply it to the problems that have unfolded since then, which, as you highlighted in the intro, are many and vastly reaching. And I think it's incredible because in the 90s, really what we had was some movies, going back to the 80s. Everybody knows war games and hackers and the net, and now those kinds of tropes are just plot lines for any movie at this point. What was it? I forget which Bond movie. I want to say it was Skyfall. Like if we see, I
Yeah.
mean, hell, Independence Day. I mean, how many movies now where hacking of some type is an issue, or a computer system is at the core of a plot. So the I think the interesting thing is we've essentially had 3 decades of infosec as we know it. Each one of those decades is entirely different than the previous, especially from a maturity standpoint. And so I think the real thing to realize for everyone, both in and outside of the industry, is it's still a very young practice, and we're learning a lot of lessons the hard way, on all fronts, whether at the practitioner level or technology or law and federal. So it went from a bunch of punk teenagers trying to learn how the big tech worked to if you combined all of cybercrime together, the largest criminal entity in human history, and from a defensive standpoint, one of the most difficult things any company can attempt to do is protect both themselves and their customers from it. And I think we all know it's a daily headline at this point. So one hell of a ride, that's for sure.
Yeah, definitely. Could you imagine when you first started this years ago, and then fast forward to now, and somebody coming in and say, "Hey, Dan, it's possible that there could be a cyber attack, and the business impact could be you're out of business."
Yeah.
I mean, you just think about that, right? I mean, because we used to stuff like email security, do content filtering, make sure people don't go to bad sites. That was kind of the big thing back then, right? A little malware, a little virus outbreak here and there. But now today we're talking about, hey, your organization could literally be out of business. Step back and think about that right there, and give me some of your thoughts about, how did it hit you, that reality?
Yeah, it is interesting because you're right. We started with this era of all the tropes that we know today. They all started way back when. I think that's actually a very interesting aspect of things like DDoS or ransomware. They go back those full 3 decades. And so you started out with things like the Morris worm, and all the worms of the 90s and the 2000s that really, they were interesting because they highlighted the problem to so many at once, right? So rather than targeted attacks, which of course you had, I mean, that's, most of us grew up on Cuckoo's Egg, and there's your
Yeah.
classic nation state sort of scenario. So we still see all those same tropes play out. It's just that everything's scaled now. The amount of money, the amount of information, it's just I think it's also once you get into the nation state, of course, it's endless, because how was World War II fought and won? It was, so much of it was based on intel, and I think so many countries learned from that, and the spying that has occurred by every nation has been immense. The spying that happens from a corporate standpoint is immense, and the spying that happens to us as consumers from the applications and the platforms that we use is immense. I say that as a concerned and perhaps angry U.S. citizen. It's amazing that every other, that the rest of the world
Yeah.
is chasing privacy law, and somehow we are slow on that front, which kind of amazes me. Our lack of regulation. However, it's I think it's all about scale, and how many people are involved now. So if you go back, say, certainly 15, 20 years, this stuff made headlines, sure, but not at the rate it does today. I mean, everybody knows about it today. Everybody has their own personal stories, even if it's just their own personal email, or their social media accounts, or their Xbox or PlayStation accounts, or whatever the case might be. I mean, there are very few people that have not had some kind of issue. And so the amount of visibility and understanding is way beyond what we had years ago. And so if we're looking at positives, that's it. And it's typically how human nature and human history play out. You got to learn a lot of hard lessons. You got to go through a lot of tough stuff to come out the other side. And that's essentially going back to my comment about it being a very young practice. That's what we've been doing, and that's what we'll continue to be doing. William, I would wager to say certainly for the rest of your and I's career, and likely thereafter for quite some period of time. In other words, it's going to be a while until we're at some kind of Star Trek level where computers are helping us, as opposed to being this constant thing that we're worried about and attempting to defend or not be nearly as paranoid about.
Well, a little side note here, since you mentioned Star Trek,
Huge fan.
and then movies. Oh, Wrath of Khan, Star Trek 2.
Oh yeah.
You do remember the plot line of how Kirk was able to outwit Khan to get the Reliant to drop his shields. Prefix code, almost like a password, right?
Yeah.
Computer to computer, ship to ship, remotely controlling another vessel, drop the shields and have it surviving. So like you mentioned before early on with some of the sci-fi movies, the ways that you have viruses, worms, a way for someone to actually access a remote system is fascinating, right? So we'll be doing this way hundreds of years now. Right?
Absolutely. I was always fascinated with Next Generation, how they were authenticating. When they were going to do something big, how Picard would authenticate with the Enterprise. Once you start thinking about a ship of that magnitude and that power, and how Geordi LaForge and all that crew is you've got people beaming back and forth. This sounds all really nerdy, and it is, but as a security person, I end up thinking about that stuff all the time, mainly because if you're not thinking towards the future and the challenges that we have today, how are you going to make anything better? So it doesn't matter whether it's computers, security, or human society. I'm always thinking of Star Trek as a pleasant goal to chase.
It is, because it's fascinating. We even map the Enterprise to like a modern Navy ship today, right?
Yeah.
Not everybody can have access to the bridge, right? It's controlled access. So similar to our IT systems, controlled access. So even back in the day with mainframes, we're always concerned about some type of user credentials to figure out who can have access to what, root access. So as long as we have humans, we need to, differentiate, client side versus user versus admin. We're always going to do positive identification. So I'm thinking the role of CISO is going to continue to gain in prominence. I figure in the next 10 years, it'll actually be that true C-suite player, that real, it's not like a C-suite kind of a small C, it's kind of a big C.
Yeah, let's talk about that for a minute, because I find this topic endlessly fascinating. Because there's a lot of people that wonder if this is, I literally heard it today, which is why I'm bringing it up. CISOs wondering if this is really the job they want to be doing. Look at the amount of CISOs that have gone. Now, my path was different. I did 20 years on the vendor side and decided that so many of the difficult problems at this point are not technology problems. And so I really wanted to move to the practitioner side to explore several different facets. And I love operational management. And of course, I've had a career of incident response for many different attack types. So I thought, well, let's see if all these skills can transfer in a positive way and try and do something new and different. But you see a lot of CISOs now going to the vendor side because it's just, it's different, and that different can be good. It's really interesting though, because everyone likes to talk about the Fortunate 2000. Everyone looks at the big, large enterprise CISOs with some kind of respect and reverence, let's say. But it's interesting. Go look at the Fortune 100, and there are very, very few CISOs on anyone's website. Very, very few. Yeah. You know where CISOs are at on websites? Vendor sites. That's probably
Oh,
where they're at.
interesting.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Why? Because the vendors are doing it, of course, to have a level of credibility. And there's been some interesting debate on LinkedIn about a lack of respect for vendor centric CISOs, which I think is also interesting. The question being, are they real practitioners running an operational environment, or are they really more of a sales tool? And not to say that's a bad thing. There can be a lot of benefits, and I think both you and I have seen that in terms of CISOs crossing over to the advisory consultancy side. It's fantastic. But it is very interesting. I think everybody was looking for the SEC ruling to kind of
Yeah.
help push that along, and to some extent it will. But yeah, the next 10 years I think will be very interesting and very telling. And the question is really what does that role end up really looking like? The problem I think with, and I'd be surprised if many CISOs disagreed with me on this, especially outside of the Fortune level. You're so much of what you're focused on really is the operational piece, is really the technology piece, and finding time for the strategic piece, which is fundamental to any executive role,
Yeah.
can be a challenge.
Yeah.
And I think because CISOs have come from so many backgrounds, right? There was no security degree in the 90s, and the question is really how much any of that really matters. So you've got so many people that kind of landed in the role, not necessarily by plan or desire, but just by happy accident. And they came from all sorts of different backgrounds, whether that be audit or technology centric, coming from maybe IT, or completely different areas. Many of them not necessarily a full career of security at all. So as we were kind of growing up in this awkward stage of infosec, that role has been different and dynamic, and I think that's been one of the challenges. There is no formula for companies to chase, so they don't know how to approach the role unless, generally speaking, unless they're post breach, right? Then they're really trying to make an effort to figure that out. I always joke, I talk about kind of three buckets of risk that any company has to manage. You've got the compliance, regulatory stuff that everybody has to do. You've got the market expectations, customer expectations, cyber insurance expectations. What is the level of due diligence that external entities expect of you? And then you've got risk, systemic risk. And that third bucket, everybody says they run a risk-based program, but it's very rare that they're actually running a risk-based program unless they're a post-breach company, because everybody's got to be on board. Everyone's got to understand that risk. And that's why you hear so much talk about, executive support, board level support, and understanding what level of communication is there, what level of reporting, all that stuff. We're just still having to figure all that out. And to be frank, it's a hell of a lot easier to figure that stuff out if you have the support. If you don't, then it really takes a bad situation to get there. As a quick mention, I'll say that's one of the things that's really pleased me about BigCommerce is having that level of support. It's not that everybody has the right answer. It's learning from all the prior mistakes and not repeating what others have done, and then trying to figure out what the right answer for your business is.
Yes, interesting. We started thinking about the history of the CISO role, because at first it was like, okay, it's all on the CIO's plate, and that they're spending all their time keeping systems up, and then all these initiatives to transform the business, right? Digital transformation. So they were just too busy, right? So they say, hey, we need somebody else to really kind of think about the threat actors, what they're doing, to be both strategic and tactical at this threat level. So we kind of have people like VP, manager of security, all these interesting titles here to kind of offload this off the CIO. Yeah. Then they say, well, they need more help. Okay, so let's start to build out this team. But you're right, though. There's no defined path for getting to CISO level. Some might be more technical inclined. Yeah. Some might be more strategic, more business. So it's like, okay, if I'm invited to the board meeting, am I prepared to actually understand what they're talking about?
which is
compared to CFOs. Yeah,
yeah. I
yeah,
mean, get on YouTube and try and look it up. There's
yeah,
like one these days. There's way more support and information out there, and it's way more of a discussion than it used to be. But I mean, just a few years ago, I mean, there's a great old talk and presentation, I think, on YouTube at this point that I think Sands did with a couple of CISOs back in the day, which was kind of one of the very early kind of conversations and people discussing it. But yeah, the I think the assumption by so many is that the board is another layer of management, and that's not what a board is about at all. They're about a level of oversight and governance, yes, but they are not another layer of management. And so you're not talking to them the same way you would be the CEO, for example. And so if you just show up with a bunch of metrics and say we block stuff and we patch stuff, it's just not helping you or them. And so for all these various CISOs over the years, depending on their background, to have to figure that out, it's been an exercise for sure. I'll say, thank you to the many that came before me, just because, you really you look at everyone that came before you. We all stand on the shoulders. And so just because I've been doing security for, oh geez, I don't want to say how long now, I guess. Yeah, it used to be 25 years. Now that's turned into 30 years. Just because you've been doing it a long time doesn't necessarily mean, you know it all. And business doesn't work that way fundamentally anyway. There's no level of technical expertise that is going to prepare you for human communication and the vastness that is, business decisions and the intricacies involved in those.
and it's interesting because it's almost like different languages, right? Board level, C-suite, they're talking about expansion, keeping down expenses, new digital transformation to help grow, reducing EBITDA, and then the CIO comes up talking about some of the technical components here. And as a role of CISO, you're looking at this and say, how do I make sure I convey in the proper way? It's not like don't do this. It's more I need to understand the technical components and the threat environment for our organization, so I can make sure the board is appropriately informed about potential risk and then some countermeasures, maybe we can reduce it.
Yeah.
And that's kind of a challenge, right? To figure out, okay, we're pretty good here. We're a very mature security program and we're doing pretty well. But then I just heard somebody say something, we're about to expand overseas. Whoa, what does that mean? I know the CIO, I see what he's doing. I see what the CTO is doing. They're taking notes and figure out what they're going to be doing, new infrastructure they're going to be laying out. And all of a sudden you're starting to think, oh, hold it. We may start using developers somewhere else. Our data may live somewhere else. And it explodes in your mind like, holy crap.
Yeah.
How in this very short period of time do I communicate to slow down or make sure I have enough bandwidth to understand what the CIO is about to do, which call it in response to what the board and the C-suite is saying we're about to go do from a business standpoint. So talk about this.
I like what you said.
Overload of.
Because the easy assumption is the CTO and CIO. But where are you more likely to get bit? Probably, or I don't want to say bit. I'm not saying it's a bad thing, but where do you need to really think about engaging that? It's really legal and marketing. Because the likelihood that the CTO or CIO pulls you in higher. Marketing is one of the fastest moving aspects of any company. And if you want to look at the bleeding edge of any company, it can be different depending on the business type. But I think in tech companies especially, and anything that's consumer based is certainly, marketing is important. They just move so fast. It's a critical component that I think gets overlooked. Now, I already admitted I have a soft spot for marketing, so maybe that's a bias. And then, of course, legal is security's, best friend. That I cannot overstate how important that relationship is. It's really, really critical. That's the amazing thing about security these days. We have, especially, you and I being old school technologists, that's where we default. But the amount of HR things I've been looped into. I think very well, BigCommerce had a large Ukraine presence, and we still do. So that was certainly one of the most difficult things that BigCommerce as a company, and I'd say me in terms of my career, have gone through. And we can come back to the Ukraine and geopolitics conversation, but I wanted to highlight something because we always like to talk about the CISO because, of course, that's who's sitting here on the podcast. But the think about the challenges from you mentioned both the board and the C level. Think about the challenge from their standpoint. You've got a bunch of executives that probably went to business school and been around the block several times, and they know what they're doing, but they don't know security beyond the headlines and their level of fear or paranoia or risk aversion. And so that's a huge part of it, is trying to come up. What I strive to do is trying to come up with some kind of shared language. I always say, you need some kind of Rosetta Stone. And the thing is, I think, most CISOs try and put together what they think is that, that Rosetta Stone. But you really need a feedback loop from those people telling you whether they understand the language or not. It's fluid. I think the issue with security is we're always looking for a silver bullet, right? We're always looking for the prescription. The problem with security versus all the other business functions is it isn't necessarily performance based, right? So you can go to the board and show a lot of metrics, financial metrics, sales metrics, marketing metrics, and they understand those and they can dissect those, and you can have intelligent, well-informed business conversations around those. It's not necessarily the case with security. You can talk about how good you're doing, but from the attacker's seat, attackers are like water. It's not about where the sandbags are piled the highest. It's about, generally speaking, where you're the weakest. Having those kind of conversations and trying to figure out a common language and I think this is really why the CISO role has been challenged in terms of little c, big C, having a seat at the table, any kind of, classic analogy we want to throw at it. That's been the real challenge. Can you properly communicate at that level and get through something that is not necessarily performance based, and be able to essentially have the executive team and the board, along with you and your function and program, come to a level of understanding around where you want the program to be. So let's take retail, for example. I think fraud is actually a really interesting. I always try and look at other industries. Maritime disasters have always been fascinating to me in terms of incident response. How many times have people used the ambulance analogies? Those sorts of things. Yeah. As I said, we're a young industry. We should probably look at the other industries that have figured out these sort of things before us. And I think that's what we should do here as well. And so, you want to be able to draw on mistakes and conclusions and what others are doing. I mentioned that might sound, like obvious, yeah. But, you and I have been around long enough that it was not that long ago. People were thinking security is special. How many people called themselves wizards, yes, or whatever BS tagline? Yes. I mean, come on, like I said, I come from the old scene. How many people still have, you can still ask people what their handle was. We're still growing out of that, and that's not where any of these other business people came from. They were doing different things as teenagers. And so
definitely, and it's kind of interesting.
Yeah, you've got to figure out some kind of language. I'll tell you what I think. There's a lot of different ways to do that. Of course, people love frameworks for that kind of thing. Frameworks are frameworks. It's not. They're useful, but they are not the silver bullet we're looking for. And so you really need to be able to talk about it in terms of what the business thinks its risk is It's and what it wants its risk appetite to be. So why did I make the mention of fraud? Well, historically, retail has always dealt with fraud, right? And a zillion different types. The business tolerance for fraud can be dynamic and move. And that's kind of the whole point. If the business is in trouble, it might really crack down on fraud. If the business is growing like gangbusters, it might have a higher tolerance. If they're doing sales, all sorts of variables involved in that. Security can be a similar thing, certainly based on the understanding of the management team, budget, the business type, all those variables. And so, we're not building Fort Knox here. The question is essentially, how much security do you want? And it's the same question you and I have to ask ourselves at personal levels. How much car insurance do we want? How much home insurance do we want? How much life insurance do we want? Nobody really enjoys that stuff. But, bad things happen, and you've got to have some level of preparedness. And as I mentioned, again, it's human nature. Generally, it takes bad things to happen. I always joke, we're humans, right? We don't put on the bug spray until we're generally already scratching and itching, and how often do we put on the sunscreen after we're already burned? And we learn these lessons over and over and over again. So it's like anything else throughout human history. It's a lot of iteration.
So, what's fascinating about that is the fact that these other industries and other areas of our life has baked in the cost of mitigating the risk, and now we don't think about it, right? So if you think about the 9/11 attack, right, we're still paying a fee, right, to help pay for security at the airport. It's over 2 decades now.
Yeah.
Or the amount we spend on the military to help defend operations over the sea for commerce. Right, that's baked in, right? That's your cost of doing business that doesn't go away. So you start to think about what have we known other aspects of life that we've actually taken away. We kind of get used to it, and now it's a cost, right? You forget about it almost.
I have to give you a quick one of those what grinds my gears comments, and what's holding us back to a great extent is these vendors, especially large ones, that are charging nickel and diming their customers for security features. Fundamentals like logging. I cannot stress enough how bad this is for good security. And I get, you and I understand the business realities, but this is never going to get to any decent level if we can't figure out how to scale good security at a level that supports these companies that are selling things. It's just, I think Salesforce, I'm going to call them out here because I think they're probably the best example of this. How many companies rely on Salesforce, and how much money is Salesforce making on charging them for logging? That just blows my mind. Logging is table stakes. And no vendor, whether they're security vendor or infrastructure or SaaS, should be, raking their customers over the coals for logging. I don't understand how that's tolerated. And again, this is difficult because everybody. I remember this was an issue certainly when I was in the vendor space. You come up with something new and it's differentiating, and we've prototyped this cool thing, or we've got this proof of concept of this new fancy feature, and immediately the executive team is like, all right, sounds like a separate SKU to me. And you really have to look at those things and say, well, can we differentiate on it? Can we market on it? Can we sell on it? It's not necessarily about nickel and diming your customers. You and I see this on a consumer front as well. How many people were happy to cut the cord on cable and now are paying a zillion subscription fees for streaming?
Yeah, that's very true.
And so, like, at some point, you've got to push back, and there's got to be balance. All of life is about balance. And when we swing the pendulum too hard to the other side, right? You and I know if we want to secure something, drop it in a safe and down to the bottom of the river, and and even then we're not confident. That you can't go that far, and you can't leave things wide open. Security is about balance, and I think these companies that are are looking to make more money off of security features that should be table stakes at this point. It's really disheartening.
It's interesting you mentioned logging because in the technology world, logging is the way we get visibility, right? It's everything that matters we have to manage. And to manage it, we got to measure it, we got to see it, we got to be able to explore what's different. And if somebody has 40, 50, 60 security controls, I got to be logging out of all of those, right? And then centralize it and make sense out of it. And then we're looking back from a leadership in IT and the security suite, like, holy crap, we can't keep up with this. So we deployed the tech, but it's kind of hard to figure out what's the performance of the security system. Because it could be literally 40, 50, 60 vendors, right? And as you talk about logging and cost, and at the end of the day, everything we want to add on adds to the bottom line. And it goes back to the business, right? The business is thinking of security as a expense. So they already calculated the return on investment required to figure out total cost of ownership. So your new digital initiative has a total cost of ownership of X, but they're doing that because all these stakeholders put their inputs in, right? Okay, marketing, how much you need, sales, how much you need. Hey, Dan, how much do we need for security to support this initiative? You got to tell them X amount of dollars, right?
Yeah.
And then you could come back too high, like, oh my God, this new security tool, I got to pay extra for logging or some other feature, and it could be out of whack. And then they're looking at you like, Dan, you're throwing off our total expenses, we're throwing off our TCO. And guess what? Our ROI for our business leaders is like, it's not a good return because you're driving too much expenses here, and you're not really articulating what that risk is.
I think that this is another big difficulty where companies, especially, I think the Fortune, especially Fortune 100, this is fascinating. Again, they no one besides security vendors have figured out how to differentiate on security. The fact that they are nickel and diming us on simplistic things like logging, and they don't have CISOs on their websites, I think highlights to you and I, certainly as security people, that you have to ask yourself, what is their level of interest in security? What is their level of investment? So we've buried ourselves in requesting, doing these questionnaires and a zillion different reports and trying to prove a level of due diligence. I don't understand why these companies just don't come out and say, hey, we actually want to be good at this. So let's take a couple examples, and I'm just going to continue dropping names and picking on some of the bigger ones. I don't know how many more breaches T-Mobile needs to, wake up and take things seriously. Will any of us ever forgive Equifax? I don't know, but they went out and hired, Jamil, and he's making a go of it. I mean, he is a marketing machine, and he is probably one of the best well-known post-breach CISOs out there. And, whether we ever forgive Equifax, I don't know. Don't say stupid things in front of Congress is what I would advise CEOs. But they're making a concerted effort, and I think that's the whole point, really, for any of these companies. It's just like I said about the silver bullet. And the silver bullet for these companies is the CISO. Historically, that's why we saw it as this revolving door role. College football coach analogy, I always say, fire the coach. Let's see if we can't win the playoffs with a different one, and recycle that. It's got to be a concerted company effort. One person cannot win you the championship. And I think those really large companies, they basically wait around to get regulated, which we're not particularly good at in the US at the moment.
Yeah.
And until they're regulated, they just don't see the point. And they don't see the point because they don't see the dollar signs. But I would love to see a couple of them make a go at it and say, hey, we take this seriously, and nobody's going to be perfect at it. But, we're doing something, and make security, a tagline, make it a part of what makes your company special. I'm sitting here, so I'll plug BigCommerce, but our CEO does it all the time. Do you want a platform with good uptime and security? That's part of our messaging. But like I said, how many more times are T-Mobile customers going to put up with this? I just find it an interesting dynamic from a consumer standpoint. At what point do we say, like, there's no hiding yourself on the internet anymore? how much all of our data seems to be open to everyone at this point because it's all been uncovered in breaches.
So it sounds like really we have to, it's a leadership responsibility, right? To set the tone and say we're intentionally going to be good at something, right? It's like being good about the quality control of a car, right? The cars are safe, planes are safe for a reason, right? They put the time in, they design it specifically for
You
that.
just nailed it.
So it seemed like
Heavy
right.
regulated industries. And so,
So that's the question, right?
yeah.
So those industries, they were told to do it, or like financial industry, they're told to do it, and they look very sharp. Organization looks good, investment looks good. But I'm almost wondering, Dan, I mean, if we didn't make people do an annual pen test, are there a certain percentage of companies who would never do a pen test?
Oh, I mean, does Facebook have a CISO? You know, I mean, you, I think, I think there's, the last 25 years of tech have been pretty mind blowing, right? Lots of growth, lots of
Yeah.
money, but not much responsibility. I find that fascinating. Uh, Zucky wants to make the metaverse, and Muskie wants to, go to space and ruin Twitter. Um, they just don't come across as very responsible individuals, do they? Since I'm name dropping everybody, Bezos on the list.
Yeah.
Um, a lot of right, they're not even responsible with their employees. Certainly not with our data. And so what are we seeing? And I'm pushing the point to make the point because I'm sure someone listening to this is getting irritated at this point. Uh, I'm basically saying regulation is coming, and we've done it to ourselves. You nailed it. Generally speaking, industries that are heavily regulated are where human life are on the line. And the issue now is not that we've always looked at computers and security as well. It's not life threatening, therefore. Well, that's the problem. Now you've got ransomware that is disrupted, pipelines and hospitals, and I think there are a lot of people out there that would argue that there is life at stake. But I think more importantly for the feds, there's GDP at stake,
Yes.
and they do not want our GDP messed with, especially by foreign entities, and they want as much control over that as possible. And so regulation is coming, and I would argue with anyone that if you don't like it, then look at the last 25 years of our neglect from a tech industry standpoint. We put the Valley on a pedestal because they make lots of money, but we've all seen Silicon Valley, one of the greatest shows ever, because of the accuracy and the lunacy
Yes.
involved. That show highlights exactly everything that's wrong with the Valley and where we've historically come as a tech industry, and that no one's ever been in it to actually make anything better. They've been in it to make a lot of money, and that can only go so far is kind of my point to this. And so what does the next 10 years look like? Yeah, probably more and more creeping regulation coming in because, the SEC has lost patience.
Yep. And that's interesting. You go back to GDP, right? So now we're talking about embedded tech everywhere. So embedded tech has connectivity. That connectivity connects to other things. That connectivity must be managed by somebody. The code must be developed for it, must be updated. It must stay up all the time. And guess what? The attackers are constantly looking to exploit code. So now, how long before we talk about loss of life, right? So embedded inside the tractor on the road or vehicle on the road gets hacked. Some hacker group accidentally does something to the control system that causes an accident and loss of life. And all of a sudden, you get a new regulation with a new acronym, right? With another framework. And guess what, Dan? That framework and guidance is going to look very familiar to what we've been talking about for the last couple of decades, right? Make sure we have governance over who can update code, identity governance, data governance. It's going to be the same thing over and over again, but it's going to have a new acronym, but the same stuff for 80% of the things. So that's a good point you bring up, right? There's going to be regulation going to be invited because we're moving too slow as an industry to take the accountability up front to build the quality in. So now they're going to force us to do it, right?
Yeah.
And say, you guys are,
I specifically want to point out tech has been negligent on this front. We know that security matters in every industry, but I think tech had an opportunity to set the path and pave that road, and they just haven't done it. They'd rather send out emails notifying us about how they've been breached and our data's out on the internet. And I think that's where my personal disappointment comes in. The fact that you and I have spent our careers in tech, and I think, I was hopeful that, hey, I get it if the other industries pick it up when they need to pick it up, but tech should have been at the forefront. They should be setting the example, and I just haven't seen it, and I'd be surprised if anyone could debate that in a serious manner. I don't think any of us have seen it. How many breach notifications have you gotten in your email and mail the last couple of years?
Quite a few. Right. And you assume with all these data privacy issues, with data privacy requires underlying security, right? So if the underlying security just so and got the breach, I guess you no longer have privacy, right? All your information is out there.
Yeah.
So I think you really hit it on the bullseye. So it's going to be forced upon us to get the quality across the board up.
Do you want to?
So I think this does.
Sorry to interrupt you, Willem. I was going to ask you if you wanted to close this awesome conversation out on the very touchy subject of geopolitics.
Definitely. So we got some young people who are looking to say, hey, you know what? I'm going to jump into this CISO role, but kind of give us some insights, because they're going to turn the news on and see one country invading another country, and we're talking about F-16 and drones and troops, and you find out some of your workers there, some of your value of commerce is over there. Kind of talk about this whole new world of nation state and warfare in the lap of a CISO.
Well,
right?
I'll tell you the reason why I want to bring it up, and it's one of my favorite topics. I didn't think that I have a history in geopolitics. I've always been fascinated with it. I'm a student of the Cold War, especially, and I didn't think I would get to use any of that at a retail and e-commerce platform like BigCommerce. But then, of course, Russia invades Ukraine, and here we are. It's bigger than that, though. I think for any young person out there, go watch War Games and go read or watch Cliff Stoll's presentation on Cuckoo's Egg. Nothing's changed. It is as it was in the 80s. But what has changed is the level at which other companies can now, for lack of a better term, mess with each other from a cyber standpoint, and not just spying. So we historically think about, spying being the obvious thing here. Obviously, China and Russia, big names here. Russia for the spying and the cybercrime aspect. They really, I think, kind of, you've got North Korea and Cuba that literally prop up their countries with cybercrime. People don't think of Cuba, but look up how many ransomware attacks have been based out of Cuba, the last couple of years. It's a thing. Nigeria, potentially. I don't know how much of that is personal cybercrime versus potentially nation state. And now the fact that Russia is sanctioned at the level they are, it's possible that they're even propping up their own economy with cybercrime. I don't know. For anyone out there, I think good resources on this. Certainly, Dmitry Alperovich is one of the best. And I think from a geopolitics standpoint, I'd mention Peter Zeihan, which I know tons of CEOs and VCs follow. So I would mention it to everyone else. You should probably do the same. I think the difference now, in other words, what's different in terms of, when you and I were coming up during the Cold War as to what's happening now. The difficulty, of course, we know we have issues with China and Russia, but the problem really becomes we have not seen cyber warfare at scale or any of the real powers being able to flex that. We all know that they're highly capable. Since the 80s, the U.S. has taken a very offensive approach rather than defensive. The U.S. is very good at it. Very, very good at it, and I don't think other countries want to find out how good or how prepared. But it's naive to think that they're not as well. And I think that will be the not to fearmonger here, folks. I'm not trying to do that, but I am trying to highlight the fact that there are capabilities and things that we do know about that haven't been seriously leveraged at scale. I think a great example that very few people know about is Project Ababil, which was back in 2013, 2014. The largest and longest, most public running campaign in probably internet history. It was over a year of DDoS attacks against US banking infrastructure. What was it really? A lot of people think, depending on who you ask, that it was really Iran testing the US ISP and internet infrastructure. And so, at least initially. And so they were, it was really the middleman, so to speak, being tested there, not necessarily just the banks. But at the same time, right, you press the banks. If you're trying to attack capitalism, so to speak, that's a good target. If it got serious, potentially retail could be a good target. So I think what's interesting now is that the idea of what critical infrastructure is changing in a lot of people's minds. And I would argue, and I'm not a DC person, I've had to spend some time there, but it's not core of what I do or who I am. But I think there's a lot of people that look at the economics now as a potential weak spot. So it's not just about defending, yes, our water and our power, but it's also about defending, the economy that's wrapped around all those things, right? Buildings don't produce, cars don't produce, humans produce, right? And if your humans can't produce, your GDP is going to plummet. So you got to have your water, you got to have your power, and you have to have the infrastructure that they leverage in order to produce that GDP. So I think things are maturing in terms of the way the feds are thinking about this. It might not have occurred to us as everyday citizens yet, but I think that's why you're going to see information security continues to be a nonpartisan issue that gets pushed every single administration. And again, I think that regulation comes, and it's not just for the things that we might. What have I been complaining about? Privacy, those sorts of things. If the feds cared about privacy, we'd have a law. That's not what they're after. They want to protect the GDP, I think. And of course, we all know that's worth protecting and matters a ton. But if there was ever a serious kind of war scenario, I don't want to again fearmonger here, but I think that that's a real possibility, and that's what they want to prevent, just as much as they want to prevent the other terrible kind of outcomes that could occur.
So it sounds like the role of the CISO is going to be very busy over the next decade. And I can assume that a lot of those small Cs are going to become larger Cs. Very multi-skilled role, business language, technical language, geopolitical knowledge. So it's like an exciting time for this particular role. So I think a lot of people looking at this could think of it as a good challenge, I would say.
Yeah.
Right. You're not.
Let me summarize, given the fact that I have fearmongered a bit on various fronts. It all comes down to situational awareness. That's really my point about any of this stuff. So, security can be a very scary thing. It's not about that. Everyone loves the Tom Clancy stories, sure. But what I'm really trying to press here is situational awareness is everything. So depending on your business, depending on where you're doing business, and the various geopolitical stresses with that, there could be, it might not even be that sort of, it could be local stresses, cyber terrorism, so many various dynamics. And so my real point here is situational awareness. You could be sponsoring a sporting event, and that sporting event, let's say the Olympics or the World Cup, is targeted by activists. And then all of a sudden you're getting defacements or DDoS or scams related to it. And that's something that you might not have taken into account as a sponsor, but here you are. And it's just oddball things like that you have to take into account. And again, that could be a marketing effort. And is marketing taking those things into account? Yeah. So that I think security, really what needs to happen, given the infancy that we are in as an industry, is that everybody needs that situational awareness. What you see in the news is reflected on the internet fundamentally.
It sounds like it's thankful we have the CISO around, right? Because that's the one person who has to, when they hear about all these new initiatives, new changes in the business model, what's going on in the environment itself, someone has to be there just to, take a look and make sure we're doing due diligence from a business risk management standpoint. Yeah. So I'm pretty excited about this role, Dan. I know we could probably talk about this for another couple of hours. I got so many questions I want to ask you, but I think it's a good place to kind of segue to the end here. you have a passion for this. So if people want to just reach out to you and have a beer with you and to talk about some of these cool topics, where can they reach you?
Well, I it used to be Twitter was a thing, but who knows what's happening there? LinkedIn. And yeah, you and I are both Austinites. Austin is near and dear to me. So yeah, if anyone's ever in Austin and wants to sync up, hit me on LinkedIn.
Hey, Dan, I really appreciate having you on the show today.
Thanks for having me. I really appreciate you putting up with my ramblings on so many different topics here, William.
Hey, great knowledge, man. We got to share. All right, everybody. This has been another episode of the Smart IT Podcast. If you want to find out more information, you can go to williamreed.info. And until next week, everybody, have a great day.